Hello, class. So I am filming this inside of the bedroom in my in-laws' house. There was a lot of commotion going on outside, and I started the video earlier, and there was just no way it was going to work. So ignore the backdrop. Okay. We are still in the process of building our house, and well, number one, trying to still sell our house. We haven't even started building our house yet. So this whole virus thing has just um, created all kinds of commotion and chaos, for us all, even with this class. But I hope you're able to keep up. I apologize for not being able to create a video last week. I've been having a lot of technical issues with internet and connectivity and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do is I have a series of two videos tonight. One talking about Poetry Week 2, and then the follow-on video, which will be uploaded tonight, will be for Week 3. And so, having said that, let's go ahead and get started. So, if you remember last week, we talked about Shakespeare and the time in which Shakespeare wrote was a politicized environment. The culture was rapidly changing in England at the time because of what Henry VIII, the way he exercised power, a lot of religious and a lot of political struggles that took place in England at the time. Now we're going to move into a period where things are, culturally speaking, are set. Protestantism has really taken a firm hold in England. And so there's not much political and cultural instability. However, what you will see in a series of poems, particularly the three out of the four, these take place in 19th century. What I mean by that is the 1800s in England. We had a different type of movement that occurred during this time period. And this is what we call the Romantic period, moving into the Victorian period. The poetry is completely different in theme, in structure, and content than it was in Shakespeare's time, which was a couple of hundred years before that, in the 16th century going into the 17th century. In the 18th century, you're going to see more of a kind of a hippie-ish kind of movement. If you remember studying American history during the 1960s, there was a big movement by the baby boomers, really kind of throwing away the conservative and business-focused attitudes and culture of their parents, and becoming a little more in touch with nature. And I'm not going to go into that whole thing, but it really was a time period in which that generation kind of went off into a different direction. And basically what I'm saying is, here were the romantics of the early 19th century, the early 1800s. They did something very similar. They broke away from the overall culture and created their own counterculture. And they were very much the hippies of their time. And so a lot of their poetry really focused on nature and getting back to more of a focusing on a provincial type of life, because the hectic nature of urban life was not something these groups of poets really cared for. They lived in the cities, but they really longed for that connection to a more provincial life, the countryside. So with these series of poems, you're really going to see a focus away from urbanized society during the 1800s in England, which really the industrial age took off during this time. And these poets kind of stepped back a little bit and started looking at the world around them and saying, well, hey, this is not really for me. I want to focus on something completely different. And, we all do that. So I'm going to leave Langston Hughes. I know he's listed first, but I'm going to kind of go chronologically here. I'm going to skip ahead and look at John Keats. So John Keats was one of these romantic poets. And there was a fellowship of these guys back in the early 1800s between three main poets. One was Wordsworth, who we're not focusing on here. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is one of our poets, and then John Keats. They were all really good friends, and they all had this similar mindset, and their poetry really focused on nature a lot. So John Keats is the first poem that we're going to look at, and that's titled "Ode to a Nightingale," which is listed on page 509. So if I look away, please don't hold it against me. I'm looking at my notes. I'm literally recording this on a bed. I don't have an office available to me right now, so I'm just making do with the best that I have right now. But on 509, we're looking at the poem by John Keats called "Ode to a Nightingale." So, first of all, just to talk a little bit about the time period. Again, this is early 1800s. England had started to industrialize, and the cities started transforming very rapidly into less of a mercantile system and more of a industrial and production center. And so the cities were at that time becoming what they are right now, which is very detached from that more agrarian societies within the country. And you've got these group of poets that felt like this urbanization that was going on was creating a culture that was becoming detached from what they feel was the natural order of things, and focusing more on business and making money and commerce and trade and stuff like that, which it's always been like that. But they wanted to really focus more on, the natural world around them, hence the term romantics. Okay. And so John Keats was one of these poets that lived during this time, and he was a very, very talented writer, probably the most talented of all three of that group. Unfortunately, he died at a very, very young age. I don't remember exactly what he died from, but his death left such a hole that William Wordsworth and his other friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge, they wrote these little memorials to him. And they really felt like that John Keats was the epitome of their romantic movement, or their counterculture movement, because of the imagery that he used. Okay, here is this new word, this imagery. Not to say that Shakespeare in his time didn't use imagery, he did, but you'll see that there's a stark difference here in that the actual message of the poem is wrapped up in the imagery. Whereas in Shakespeare's time, the imagery was used as a tool to enhance the in-your-face, matter-of-fact message that he was trying to send. Okay? So the imagery that's used by Keats is actually the message. It's not a tool, it's actually the message. And so Ode to a Nightingale is one of these poems that, in the romantic sense, it's really a simple image of a bird at night. So if you know anything about a nightingale, they only come out at night. They're very nocturnal. And late in the evening, they sing these little songs. They're one of the few that actually do stir at night and almost act like it's daytime. And Keats was one of those poets, kind of like Coleridge and Wordsworth, where they would take a simple little image like that and just create this whole poem with a certain context and meaning centered around this one image. And for Keats, The nightingale served as a very distinct message or kind of imagery for him. And I've got a little note here in the analysis, and that the Ode to the Nightingale was really Keats's perception. So here we go. We're going back to this perception. Keats, just like all of us, is stuck in the cave and he's viewing the world around him, the image of it, and he's basically trying to derive his own meaning of what's really going on. And this act of this small little creature of nature, this nightingale, was able to influence his whole perception of what was going on in the world around him. And so the nightingale really, as you read through the poem, the nightingale really represents this conflicted nature. Okay, it's a conflicted nature of human life. In other words, the interconnection or the mixture of pain and joy, and the intensity of feeling and numbness, or the lack of feeling and numb, on top of, it kind of represents a little bit of life and death, and the immortal and versus the immortal. So there's some paradoxes that are drawn up into this image of the nightingale. So in the first stanza, he's kind of sitting back and he's listening to this nightingale, and he feels joy, but he also feels pain at the same time. He gets joy and pleasure from the song, but at the same time, he kind of feels a longing, for a simpler time. And he realizes that the world around him is changing, and that this nightingale is beautiful, and as pleasurable as the sound is to him, at the same time, it brings about this melancholy feeling that, at one time we were content with listening to this nightingale at night, but now the world is moving so fast that most people don't even stop to listen to it. So it's one of those images that has a kind of a paradoxical meaning to it, and you can pick that out actually in the words that he's using. He talks about my heart aches, and the drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though the hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past. Words like that really give you this feeling, this emotion of pain. Okay, even though the actual act is one that should bring you happiness and joy. And really, you look at throughout the whole poem, it's kind of a mixture of that. And that's one of the neat aspects of using an ode, an ode is a type of poem that allows you to have some flexibility with the meter. So you can mix it up. You're not really focused on a set number of beats per line. You can change it up from line to line. And doing that, you're allowed to kind of change the emotions and the feelings that the reader is feeling at the time that he's reading it or she's reading it. And then combined with the imagery, you're kind of getting this flip-flop. It's kind of like making you happy, making you sad, making you happy, and then making you sad again. It's a very unique style. It's one that is really depends on your own personal taste. So that's John Keats. I mean, I don't have a lot of time because I don't want to make these videos too lengthy, but at the very nutshell, I guess the thesis of what I'm trying to say with John Keats with the ode to the Nightingale is basically writing a commemoration of this natural event that's happening, and he's using this poem to express the feelings, happy, positive and negative, happy and sad, that he's feeling while he's listening to this nightingale sing. And it's all wrapped up in this whole age of industrialization that's going on around him, and it makes him happy to be close to nature again, but it also makes him sad because he's realizing what's going on in the world around him. Okay. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, again, he was a friend of Keats. We were looking at one of his poems on 525, I believe. Let me check my notes. Yeah, 525. This is a very simple poem, very quick. Not going to spend a lot of time on it because there's really not a lot of message to it. And reading through this poem, you're probably looking at it going, oh my God, what in the hell is he talking about? Really, there's no hidden message to it. Okay. Metrical Feet is an attempt by Samuel Taylor Coleridge to demonstrate the art of poetics to his son. His son was wanting to write poems like his father, and as all young sons do or young children do, they come to the parent and they say, "Hey, teach me how to do this." And really, this was Coleridge's way of teaching his son the different styles of poetics, all wrapped up in one little poem. So in Metrical Feet, you look at, you can pick out some keywords in here like dactyl, trochee, anapestic, spondy. These are poetical terms that we did not have time to talk about in class, and I hate that. But if you look on page 524, on the page before that, it actually gives you a basic introduction on how meter and rhyme are used to craft lines of poetry. Okay, so when I'm talking about the meter, I'm talking about how the poet uses the beats, okay, that happen naturally within syllables within the English language, how the poet divides those up to create a line of poetry. Okay, so for my band students, you will know this probably better than anyone else, that you're looking at a sheet of music. Excuse me. And you have on that sheet of music, you have all of these metrics in there, right? And then basically the metrics allow you to see exactly how the measures are broken up, how many beats per measure are located within that sheet of music. Poetry is the same way. Okay. Although we're not focusing on notes, we're focusing on syllables. Okay. And so the different types of syllable combinations, like iambs, within that 1 foot line, you'll have an unstressed and stressed syllable. Okay. Versus a trochee, which is stressed and then unstressed. It's just the opposite of that. Anapestic is one that's a combination of 2 unstressed plus a stressed syllable, and then dactyl is the stressed with followed by da-da-da. Okay, so a stressed and then 2 unstressed syllables. And then you have your actual measure of the foot line. So you have a monometer, which is 1 foot. So you only have, a combination of that 2 syllables or 3 syllables from the metrical foot, all the way up to octometer, which is 8 beats per foot. Okay. So an example would be Shakespeare's iambic pentameter. So what we mean by pentameter is you have 5 feet within that line, and then iambs are the combination of the unstressed and stressed that happens 5 times over within that line. Okay, so what Samuel Taylor Coleridge is doing is he's basically instructing his son on the different types of meter that occur in poetry. And at the same time, within the lines, he's showing him how you can stretch out these metrical play, this metrical play over different lengths in the line. Okay, so from trimeter all the way up to octometer and stuff. So there, like I said, there's no hidden meaning in this. Other than the fact, if you know a little bit about Coleridge and you've studied his life, and you would know that this poem was an exercise. There's no aha moment. Oh wow, this is a life changing moment. No, it's just a little academic exercise on how to write poetry, and how to learn to craft poetry using meter and rhyme. Um, Said that, let's move on to the third one, which was Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, Alfred Lord Tennyson was one of my favorite poets growing up. He wrote a poem called The Lady of Shalott that was put to music by Lorena McKennitt, for anybody who knows the Canadian singer Lorena McKennitt. If you've never heard that song, look it up on YouTube or Apple Music or Spotify. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. She is a wonderful singer, and she plays the harp, and she actually takes this poem, The Lady of Shalott, and puts it to music. It's absolutely wonderful. But Alfred Lord Tennyson was a nobleman who lived in Victorian England, so England under the reign of Queen Victoria, the great grandmother of the current queen, or great great grandmother, I can't remember. So he was a nobleman who became poet laureate. So poet laureate is a honor that's given to the top poet in a country. Specifically, we're talking about the UK. We do have one here in the United States, but I can't, for the life of me, I don't know from year to year who gets that honor. It's not something I focus on. I'm not even sure who's the current poet laureate in England. But at the time, Alfred Lord Tennyson was considered the premier poet during his time period. And I had the note here. Now I've lost it. Let me bring it up real quick. Give me just a second. So, Charge of the Light Brigade. Charge of the Light Brigade, which is listed on page 528. Charge of the Light Brigade is a poem that has some historical significance, but it's also written in a style to make you feel something at the time that you're reading it. Okay, again, we're talking about sights and sounds here. So he's using imagery, but he's also using sound to give you the kind of feeling of what's going on while you're reading this poem. And I'll read it for you real quick, because like I said, it's one of my favorites. So like I said, it's on page 528, Charge of the Light Brigade. And I want you to listen as I'm reading this, kind of get an idea in your mind of what does it sound like. So here we go. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? No, though the soldier knew somewhat had blundered. Theirs was not to make reply, theirs was not to reason why. Theirs was but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. So if you listen at that very first part of that stanza, half a league, half a league, half a league, onward. So what do you feel? What's the first thing that pops into your mind? So if you kind of get the feel that that's a horse, sounds like a horse, half a league, half a league, half a league, onward. Okay. This is written in a certain meter. I do believe it is dactylic. Is that right? Or no, it's anapestic. It's anapestic, which is that unstressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, stressed. It kind of gives you that, you know, that kind of a feel, as though a horse were galloping across the battlefield. That's exactly what Tennyson's point is. He's trying to give you a sense and this picture in your mind of what it was like for these guys that were on horseback charging. Okay, so he wrote this in commemoration of a fateful, horrible charge that took place in the Crimean War, The UK was involved in this war with the Ukrainians and the Russians, and this order was given that the Light Brigade, the lighter armored cavalry, were to charge the line in order to soften it up. And they didn't realize at the time that how heavily fortified that line was. So it was basically a massacre. Okay, this light cavalry charging into this heavily armored line, just absolutely plunged into their death, you know. And you kind of get that feel for, as the horses are charging and galloping across the field, that it's just, and a lot of people, even during this time, was like, what possessed them to do that? Well, Tennyson says it right there in the end. Theirs was not to make reply. Theirs was not to even reason why. Theirs was but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. 600 light cavalry charged into this line, and they were all slaughtered. And it was such a gallant, although kind of a blunder, it was still a gallant charge, that Tennyson was so affected by the events of that and reading about it in the newspaper, he felt that it was his duty, poet laureate, to commemorate the bravery of the Light Brigade, this light cavalry making this charge. And he, like I said, he crafts the poem in a way to where you get this feel of the horses galloping really quickly at first, and then if you feel at the end of the second stanza, it's kind of lightening off a little bit, and then you don't feel that hard stress within the lines, but with the content that you're reading, it's almost like it's just poof, you know. It just, as far as the meter and stuff, it just stops. You know, you don't have that same feeling that you did in the first stanza, and that's the reason why he's doing that, is to give you that imagery of this cavalry charge just going into the line, and then it just stops, and then theirs is not to reason why, you know. So it kind of gives you a feel for what these guys experienced while they were making this charge, and what happened when they actually hit that line. It was crazy. So that's the third poem. We're going on to the fourth poem, which is Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes is 20th century. Okay, and this is an American author. If you know anything about Langston Hughes, he's considered the father of the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so this is the father of African American poetry, and writing about many themes that were very important to African Americans, especially during the early part of the 19th century. And this is a wonderful poem about what it was like for African Americans during this time period. And we're talking about a time before the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, and he wanted to commemorate that time period because, as you've probably learned in history class and some other literature classes, or as you will learn, there were many injustices that took place during this time period, and African Americans really were disenfranchised during this time, and were really put at a disadvantage, not only just socially but economically, and that's really what Langston Hughes is focusing on here, is the inequity that was taking place in a socio-economic standpoint. And if you read through the poem, the poem is pretty straightforward. You really read through the poem as Langston intended. You kind of follow along with the story, and he's just like making. He's created this hypothetical situation, but he's making commentary about it. And he's really trying to drive home the point about, this is not right. Why is this happening? Okay. So the Ballad of the Landlord on page 437, it starts off, Landlord, landlord, my roof has sprung a leak. Don't you remember I told you about it last week? Landlord, landlord, these steps is broken down. When you come up yourself, it's a wonder you don't fall down. $10 you say I owe you, $10 you say is due. Well, that $10 and more I'll pay you till you fix this house up new. Right? Okay, so you've got this hypothetical situation where this person's living in this rental, and it's a slum. The roof is leaking, the stairs are broken, and the landlord only comes around to ask for the money, and he's not really using the money to give them a sanitary and safe place to live. And he calls him out on it. And then what happens? What? You going to get eviction orders? You going to cut off my heat? You going to take my furniture and throw it into the street? What? Why are you doing this? Because I'm asking you a question about why you can't provide me, adequate housing? You're taking my money and you're not doing anything constructive with it. You're just taking my money and spending it on God knows what. Dang sure not on house repairs or apartment repairs. Goes on. You talking high and mighty, talk on until you get through. You ain't going to be able to say a word when I land my fist on you. Well, here we go. Police, police, come get this man. He's trying to ruin the government and overturn the land. Okay? So right there, it kind of turns. You really get the meat of what Langston Hughes is trying to say with this poem, in that you have a simple act of not really active defiance, but simple questioning, passive questioning. And first instance where he makes a joke, well, I mean, yeah, there was a threat there, but it was a simple little threat that he wasn't going to carry through. And immediately he's going to call the police and accuse this guy of trying to overturn the government and the culture. Well, good on him. He should have been overturning the culture, because what these people were living through was not right. Copper's whistle, patrol bell, arrest, precinct station, iron cell, headlines in the press. You see right there, there is really no meter at that point, no rhyme. It's just straight, small little lines about what's actually going on. Man threatens landlord, tenant held no bail. Judge gives Negro 90 days in county jail. 90 days in county jail for an idle threat. Really not for that. It's basically for, as Langston Hughes was saying, this person was standing up for himself, standing up for his family, calling out an injustice, and trying to do what was right, and they threw him in jail for it. And as we know, many people during this time, white, black, Native American, many people during this time was calling out the injustices. And the overall dominant culture at the time was like, we don't care. And so, disproportionately, African Americans suffered unduly for this discrimination, culturally, socially, and economically, all for something that really didn't make a difference. And I mean, we can look back on it today and go, wow, if they knew then what we know now, look at all of the lives that could have been improved just by treating people with common decency and respect, right? Okay, so that ends Poetry Week number 2. I'm going to come back later tonight and give you Poetry Week number 3. And so, like I said, these are just brief descriptions on what these poems are about. They were written by the people who wrote them, and the content and the basic premise of what each of these poems were talking about. I do have a list of questions within the discussion boards that I want you to address that will help you understand the poems better and kind of reinforce some of the things we talked about in here. And then kind of give you an opportunity to express some of your thoughts on, not your feelings, but your thoughts about the poem. or about the poems, and then discuss them with your classmates, because as we talked about earlier, there's two different things that we're talking about here: allegory and applicability. Allegory is what's intended by the author or the poet, and applicability is what is inferred by the reader. Okay, both are credible, both are necessary. Okay, I just wanted to give you the allegorical side of it, what basically what the poets intended with the poems. But feel free to give your interpretations, your applicable interpretations, and talk about them with your fellow students in the discussion board. Okay. All right. So next video, which will be coming either, I want to try to work on this tonight and get it out there on YouTube. Should be coming tonight for Poetry Week number 3. We're going to talk about those poems, and then I'm going to talk briefly about the final assignment. Okay, and then give you some final words of encouragement to get you through the rest of the semester. Okay, so I will see you guys later on. Again, if you have any questions, if you need some help with the interpretation, definitely shoot me an email or send me a text, and I'll be glad to help you out with that. So I hope you guys are safe and healthy. Hopefully this will all be over with soon. I know I'm ready for it. So, okay, guys, I will talk to you again here shortly with video number 3 for Poetry Week number 3. And you guys take care and do good work.